Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to resilience, business continuity, disaster planning, well-being, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. As many of you know, I love to read. I read all the time for entertainment and education purposes. And sometimes I come across a book where I want to reach out and get the author on the show to talk about their subject because I think it's something that all of us can leverage and can learn from. So the book today we're going to talk about is Psychological Safety, the Key to Happy, High-Performing People and Teams. And I'd like to welcome to the show today one of the co-authors of the book, Dr. Dan Radecki. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here talking about this.
Now, you and I have spoken a few times. We planned out what we're going to talk about today. So I know a little bit about you. Can you take a minute or two and tell our global viewers and listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm a neuroscientist by training, and I worked in the biotech, biopharmaceutical industry for about 25 years. And in that industry, as a neuroscientist, a behavioral neuroscientist, but also as a leader in the corporate realm, I saw the disconnect between how we grow leaders, how we build leadership capabilities, and what the brain actually is doing. There's sort of this disconnect of we understand how the brain works, but we're not really putting that into practice when we develop leaders. We expect leaders to be able to, they're very technologically savvy. So we say, okay, you're a leader now, all right, because you have knowledge of science or whatever. And it's not necessarily the case. So I really was interested in this idea of building leadership based on what we know about neuroscience and how the brain operates. And so that's why I got into this field and co-founded the Academy of Brain-Based Leadership with my partner, Lee Hall. And we've been doing this for going on 9 years now, and it's been really rewarding.
Well, and congratulations on the book. It is a great read, lots of good information, and this is what we're going to focus on today.
Great.
So my first question for you is going to be an easy one. What does psychological safety mean?
Yeah, that's...
Well, it's easy to ask.
Well, it's become a very popular concept these days. Psychological safety as an idea has been around for 60, 70 years. But just since Google did some research a few years ago on it and applied it to Google, people started paying attention to it. Really, to take a step back, if you think of what physical safety is, right? We know what that is. We have all these standards in place, OSHA rules, all these things to make sure we are physically safe. Maslow's hierarchy of needs has food, water, shelter, all these physical things in place. A couple decades ago, we started thinking about what about our psychological needs? What about our emotional needs? These seem to be important too. And what we're finding is that psychological safety, as opposed to physical safety, is also a critical piece of us as humans being able to get the most out of our brain, whether that's being creative, decision-making, collaborating. Psychological safety seems to be a key piece of this. And so to me, what it means is that ability to allow yourself to understand what's driving your triggers for stress, your stress response. Understanding that based on the fact that our brain has these stress triggers, what that means for how you behave, how you come off to other people. And at the end of the day, psychological safety is about being able to feel vulnerable and to be yourself with individuals, with teams, within an organization, and not feeling like it's going to be held against you. Say, if you question someone's mistakes or if you try to put a new spin on things that has been the status quo. So it really is
that kind of like
vulnerability.
You just said something that I thought was really grabbed my attention. Being vulnerable and not feeling weak in front of
Yeah,
other people?
yeah. Yes, that's exactly what it is. It's allowing yourself to feel vulnerable, and not feeling like that's going to be held against you, and that it's okay to be vulnerable. In fact, some of the research that's been done, Amy Edmondson, who's sort of one of the pioneers in this field of psychological safety, that's exactly how she put it. She said leaders should feel in a psychologically safe team like they can admit to mistakes, they can show vulnerability, and
Yeah.
they feel okay about it. They don't feel like, we have this old notion of what leadership is, that you have to have the stiff upper lip and pretend like you have all the answers. Well, that just doesn't work. And that's not how our brain is wired.
Yeah, that old Victorian way.
Exactly.
That
Yeah.
you're a leader, so that means you have all the answers. But that's not true.
It's no, and it's not something that's sustainable to even pretend. And what we see now in this field of burnout and the brain is that's what happens when you suppress all of this and you put up this great front. It's going to come out somehow. And usually the way it comes out is in the form of burnout, an emotional, burnout, or just not being able to manage things, stress, anxiety, that type of thing.
Yeah, which ends leads to other things. Your health, and I know we're going to touch on some of these things down the road too. But then your health starts to suffer, and those around you start suffering as well.
Of course.
Now, you also go on in the beginning of the book. You introduce a co-pilot, but with the acronym of RFC. Well,
the PFC.
Oh, did I say it right? Yeah, sorry, PFC. I'm sorry, I'm reading my own notes wrong. What did you mean by that, having a co-pilot?
So the way the brain is wired through evolution, it's really focused on safety, okay, so that we feel a sense of safety in our environment. If you think about it, it makes sense. We needed to feel like things were okay. What was in our environment was what was known, expected. So our brain is wired to be really good at looking for and maintaining safety. So it's focused on threat. Okay, our brain, first and foremost, the way it's wired, it's focused on threat. And that is a big part of our brain. We call it the lower brain. Okay, it's sort of the brain that we share in common with a lot of species. A dog, if you have a dog and the dog sees a stranger, it's going to bark. It's going to attack maybe, right? Because that stranger could represent a threat. It's an unknown. We as humans, if you get in an elevator, Alex, and you see someone you don't know, you're probably not going to bark at him and attack him, right? You're probably going to say, oh, hi, my name's Alex. You're going to have pleasantries. That is a part of our brain that's somewhat unique to humans that allows us to override that threat brain. And that's called the PFC, the prefrontal cortex. Okay. And our goal, when we try to teach people about the neuroscience of leadership and psychological safety, is to really operate more with that PFC, that uniquely human brain, that brain that allows us to do things like take someone else's perspective, even if we don't agree with it, or empathize with someone who's in pain, even though we're not going through it, right? These are things that are really high level, but they require that PFC to be fully engaged. And that's not always easy to do, because when you're under stress, that PFC, it goes offline and we sort of revert to that dog with a stranger.
You gave an interesting example there about being in an elevator and you might turn around and introduce yourself. What does it mean if you get in an elevator, there's someone you don't know, and instead of introducing yourself or saying, hey, and I'm sure you've seen this, the two people move off to the side.
Yes.
What does that mean?
That's the natural reaction we have in our brains there's this thing called in-group, out-group, and it's the way our brain is organized. And again, everything goes back to our brain wants us to feel safe. It's looking for threat. It's monitoring for threat. And when you get near someone who you don't know, who isn't familiar or similar to you, many times you will try to keep a distance. We can say social distance now because we know what that means, but you try to keep this safe distance. And a lot of times you won't interact, you won't make eye contact, because through evolution, eye contact can be a sign of aggression, right? So we tend to look down, or now we have phones we can pretend we're looking at. But that is just a natural reaction in the brain. And that's a nice illustration of this idea of in-group, out-group. The way our brain is wired. We'll talk about that later about biases, but basically the brain's wired to treat someone who's different from you as either part of your in-group, a friend, or an out-group, a potential foe, simply based on whether or not I know them and if they're likable to me. So that person in the elevator, you may not know them, they may not be likable, they may be a threat. All this is going on, by the way, beneath your level of consciousness. You're not thinking about it, you're just acting. So what am I going to do? I'm going to give them space, and I'm not going to look at them. And that's a lot of times what we do.
Interesting. It just as that example that you gave, it's like, wow, half the time I get in the elevator, and if someone's in the middle, instantly they're on one side and I get on right to the other, without even thinking about it. You separate.
But if it was a friend, you probably wouldn't do that.
Yeah, if it's not a friend, it's you sometimes you don't even turn around. You're still facing them. It's like, hey, how's it going?
Yeah. They're not a threat because you know them.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned an interesting word there, biases.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that, because you bring that up a few times in the book about biases. So why should we pay attention to those?
Well, first of all, biases get a bad name, right? If I'm just taking a neuroscience perspective, all biases is a mental shortcut. All right, they're wired into our brain for a reason. Nothing that happens with our brain and even our bodies does so by accident. So biases are a way to conserve energy in your brain. Like, I'll give you an example. I live in Southern California, and traffic here is brutal. So I can get in my car, and I've been driving my same route to work for 18 years. I can get in my car and I can be at work in 40 minutes. And I tell you, I couldn't remember a single thing. I couldn't tell you anything I saw along the way. I just go on autopilot. Okay. That's because I've ingrained that route to work as a habit, right? It's ingrained in my brain. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to ruminate, consider it, anything. I can just get in the car and go. And for better or worse, it works, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the way the brain is wired. It's wired to automate things to make it easier for you, because that PFC that I talked about, we don't want to have to use that too much. It's very resource intensive. It takes a lot of energy. It wears out easily. So I can just use habits and use the other parts of my brain and not have to think about it. And so that's really what biases are. Biases are path of least resistance for the brain, making a decision or a behavior based on the path of least resistance. And here's another example. When we hear biases, I'll use the one that people typically use, profiling in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, something like that. If I grow up, I'll use an example that some neuropsych research is looking at. If I grow up as a child and I'm not exposed to, let's say I grow up in America, and in rural America, and I'm not exposed to, I don't travel a lot, I'm not exposed to anyone from mainland China. I never see them. I don't see representations of them in my world. I see them on TV, and on TV, they only serve a certain purpose. They're very stereotyped. I grow up my whole life thinking of this stereotype as a mainland Chinese person in my head. When I encounter them, I'm going to have this bias that they need to fit into that stereotype. Why? Because that's what I've grown up with. That's what's been ingrained into my brain. I can stop and consider the fact that, okay, this is my bias. This is how I saw it. But in reality, I know this is just that, a stereotype. That takes the PFC. That takes a lot of work. It's easier for us as humans just to default to those biases. And that's where we get into trouble, as we see in society, when we default to these biases.
How do we even recognize we have a bias? Yeah. Because it happens in our personal lives. Organizations talk about it. We see it everywhere. So how do we even recognize in ourselves that we have them?
Yeah, it's and this is the hard part. It's the whole idea of metacognition, which is thinking about thinking. We're not very good at that. We don't do that. We like to behave, like I said, on autopilot. So it takes some effort. All right, it takes some effort, and we talk about self-awareness and reflection of what could be triggering your biases. And we have an entire model that we've developed, which is based on some of the neuroscience research around what do people need to feel psychologically safe? What are there commonalities that all of our brains need to feel psychologically safe? And if we feel psychologically safe, then we're going to mitigate our stress, and we're going to be more open to use that PFC. We won't be sort of a slave to our biases. So we have a model that we use, that we teach, that gives people a little insight about which one of these sort of variables are most important to their brain for triggering their biases. And with that self-awareness, then you can reflect on, okay, I need to be aware of the fact that, let's say my trigger, my bias is autonomy. I see the world through a lens of having to control everything. And if I don't, then I feel psychological distress and I have issues with that. And so we use that safety model, as we call it, to be able to teach people about what their specific biases are.
And we're going to talk about the security measure in just a minute, because we're
Yeah.
going to break that down. It's interesting you mentioned that self-awareness, because I'm a strong believer, at least in the last year to year and a half now, in our industry, there's a lot of talk about resilience, operational resilience, organizational resilience, and looking at things like that. And I've started to come to the opinion that, if you want to develop those kind of things, the hardest part is to start with yourself.
Yeah.
And create that self-awareness and really look at it. And you explained it well with, looking at our biases and things like that.
Yeah, and the great thing about resilience, that's the word that's really been kicked around a lot these days.
Yeah.
Like you say, it does start with the individual. If you want to build resilience on a team, an organization, it really has to start with the individual. And resilience is, I'll take a neuro geek approach with this. When you talk about resilience, we think it really is the ability to maximize that PFC. That's really what it comes down to. And you can see this. You can see it in the wiring of the brain, the plasticity, the physiology of the brain, when you do things like mindfulness training, when you practice things like perspective taking, empathy. People who are emotionally intelligent, they seem to be able to access that PFC more often and longer than people who don't.
Mm-hmm.
The other end of the spectrum is people who are in total burnout and can't access that PFC. Their behavior's just being driven by that lower brain, that brain we have in common with all the other species, that's going to be very threat-based. It's going to be fight or flight, and everything's black and white. You're either friend or foe, this type of thing.
Is that some sort of ingrained fear?
It is. That's the way.
Because as you said, resilience starts with, looking at yourself, but then the opposite spectrum, those people, it sounds like they're afraid to admit they have faults or admit.
Oh, of course. It's not easy to do. So again, the other part of this is our brain is wired to really be averse to thinking we're wrong. Okay. We get, when we feel we're right, we get a boost of the pleasure neurotransmitter dopamine. When we think we're wrong, or if someone tells us we're wrong, we get actually a pain response in our brain. So reflecting on your behavior, your biases, that implies that you've been wrong all along, or that you've done something wrong. So it's not easy to do. It takes some time. It's not natural for us because of the way our brain is wired. But we see the benefits, not just in a leadership realm or on a team, but in your personal life. Because all of this stuff is there's a mind-body connection here, and it affects your health as well as your emotions.
Yeah. On that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. We are talking today with Dr. Dan Radecki, co-author of Psychological Safety, and we will be right back. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.